Hey everyone, welcome to another midweek conversation. Talk about this past Sunday's message, some of this week's readings, kind of wherever the conversation leads. So as we continue through Psalms, this was just our second week in the new series, and so we were looking at Messianic Psalms. Just really
fantastic.
Yeah, so incredible to see the details of Christ that God used, the scribes of the Bible generations earlier to reveal. And so really enjoy the Messianic Psalms, love those. And we're reading Ephesians 3, Hebrews 1, 1 Peter 2, in light of Isaiah 28, verse 16. So we can talk about that. Was there anything from the sermon you wanted to talk about? What you got for us?
We can just jump in, but I did love in the sermon when you didn't go through every psalm, but you went through a pretty big chunk of the entire multitude of the Psalms.
Yeah.
Outlining, it's all about Jesus.
The Psalms are overwhelmingly about Jesus.
So I thought that was it was just pretty cool to see. Whenever you're talking about Messianic Psalms or Messianic prophecies, one of the most beautiful things about it, I think, is like you see how interwoven the Bible is. Like you said, like generations apart, years apart. And so I just thought that was a great showing,
Yeah, the volume of it is really astounding to consider.
Yep.
Okay, so then looking at the reading, we talked about in Psalms describes Jesus as the cornerstone, which we also see the language in Isaiah, and then sprinkled throughout the rest of the Bible. And in Isaiah 28:16 specifically, then God describes Jesus as a tested, sure, and precious foundation, a sure foundation, a tested cornerstone, And so part of the reading as we're reading these chapters, as we're considering the Psalms, was, these are three of the primary adjectives used to describe Jesus as a foundation of the church in our lives. So where do we see those adjectives pop up in the reading? But then I think the question that would be fun for us to unpack or spend a little bit of time talking about is, why do you think those three adjectives get such an emphasis? Because it's in Isaiah, it's quoted, and I'm not going to say which one in case you haven't read the chapters yet, but it's quoted in one of the three chapters that we're reading, and two of the other chapters obviously tie into it as well. So when you consider these adjectives, tested, precious, and sure, why do you think those three adjectives, and I'm not asking you to hypothesize about God's intent but I'm asking more when you consider those three adjectives in your life, what do those three remind you of? How does God use the emphasis on those adjectives?
Yeah, tested, the first things that are coming to mind, so tested, a tested foundation or cornerstone. You think about the suffering of Jesus, and you hit on that really hard on your sermon, which was really cool. Just like he was a man acquainted with grief, he was a man of sorrows. He was tested, And what comes to my mind is the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is. He sees what's approaching, he knows what's approaching, and in his humanity, he is. He's saying, he's basically grieving. He's like, God, Father, this is too much.
But take this from me.
Yeah. But I know your will, and I know, you know what I mean? And then you think about the brutalness of the crucifixion and his death and tested. And even in his life when he is, ministering to people, the Pharisees coming and testing him, testing his authority or testing his power to heal.
Yeah.
So not only in his suffering, but even in his ministry that he was trying to show the Jewish people, it's I'm tested. So that comes to my mind. Sure, being because he was tested and he's proven, he's proven that, through his testing, he is a sure foundation.
Yeah, firm foundation.
He is not a rocky ground. He is not a crumbling ground. He is a sure foundation. And so you think about that with your faith, this is why we can trust in Jesus, because he is sure, he is firm, and he's solid. And then precious, I mean, I'll let you unpack precious
Yeah.
or whatever, is you're thinking with these things. But.
Yeah, I agree with the tested and the sure. I think one of the words that really comes to mind for me is that, like you were getting there at the end, that trustworthiness. We even talk about like, oh, he's battle tested. Like you can trust this. They talk about athletes, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, this guy's been tested in the toughest,
Yeah.
most pressure intense situation, so you can trust him to lead this game. Like we use that word for just grown men getting paid untold amounts of money to play a child's game. Like, but yet we're like, oh, he's tested. So clearly tested is something that means a lot to us, And so I really like what you said with tested and with sure. I think for precious, when it talks about, he's a precious foundation, a precious cornerstone. One of the I love that adjective, perhaps in the, I didn't tell you this, I didn't tell him this. You just kind of picked that one to leave for me. It's actually my favorite of the three. Okay. Not that any one is like better than any of the other, but
it's the one that you lean.
It's the one that just resonates with my heart the most, because when I think of something precious, I think of something that you cherish, and something that you prioritize and have a zeal for. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like my daughter is precious to me. Yep. My marriage is precious to me. So I will sacrifice other things for them. I will set aside other things that distract me from my wife and daughter because they are precious to me.
Yeah.
And so there is a cherishing in my heart of, I delight in this. And so I love that Jesus is described as precious, because it's that reminder, like, okay, you think of the seraphim, whose name comes from like people, like ones who were literally burning with zeal for, and it's like, all right, is Jesus really precious to me?
Yeah.
Is he really, he's not just my Lord in like this authoritative sense. He's my authority, but he's not this like cold, distant Lord. It's like, no, this is my precious Lord. This is my cherished Lord. Do I approach him with a zeal?
Yeah.
Like, I will set things aside that distract me from him. I will sacrifice other things so that I don't have to sacrifice my time with him. I want him to get my best because he is precious.
Yeah.
The parable that he tells, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a guy finds in the field. And,
that's a good
when he finds the treasure, he's like, I'm going to sell everything to make that treasure my own. And so I love precious because, if I'm being brutally honest, and anybody who has known me for more than a month knows I tend to be brutally honest. I think the American church, I'm talking about the big picture American church, I think we've lost some of the preciousness of Christ. I think...
Now, why do you think that is? Is it like... we just get lost in the weeds? Do we just get lost in the routine? Or is it just like... I
think we get lost in the routine. I think we get lost in the weeds. I think we get overwhelmed. I think we take our eyes off his throne and we get distracted by what's going on around us. I think we get egotistical and we make it all about us. I mean, if I use the phrase church hopping, every single pastor and probably 80% plus of the average Christian in the country knows what I mean.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's, I'm just in the I'm in the market for what's best for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, church isn't about me. Church is about Jesus.
Yeah.
And no, I'm not saying, maybe we find ourselves in a church that really isn't healthy and we need to, sure. But I'm talking about church hopping, where it's the moment they ask too much of me, the moment things get tough, like, I'll just move on to whatever's easier next, right? And church isn't about us. Church is about Jesus. So I think it's a combination of we get egotistical. I think it's a combination of we get apathetic. I think when you're talking about the Western church, the American church, the European church, we haven't faced persecution. We haven't faced real persecution like the Asian church or the Middle Eastern church. And so you grow lazy. I mean, you
idle.
You grow idle. You know what I mean? Like, think of an animal in the zoo. And they talk about how, so there's a wolf sanctuary. Here we go. There's a wolf sanctuary by my parents' house. And we've gotten to go there and tour it. It's really cool, really great experience. But they talk about how, once wolves have been exposed to human ownership or, like being in a circus or in a sideshow or something. Like, they can't be the tour we on. Someone has asked, like, so do you guys ever like release these wolves back in the wild? And they're like, no, we can't.
Oh, wow.
Because once they get used to just being simply fed, they grow complacent and they lose that like fighting wolf mentality.
Oh, wow.
I think that's the American church. I think that's the European church. I think that's the Western church. It's been easy. Life's been easy.
Yeah.
And so Jesus doesn't have to be precious because it's like for most of the European and American church goers, you don't have to make a choice, Jesus or your literal physical life.
Yeah, that's true, man.
Like,
that's true.
You know what I mean? Like, we don't have to make a choice like, okay, it's either my life or Jesus.
Yeah.
It's either my wife and children or Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, if I choose Jesus, I will be forcibly evicted from my home. It will be burned, and I will have to flee from a mob. We don't have that problem.
Yeah.
Mercifully, but sometimes I think we don't have that blessing.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a blessing. I mean, obviously, it doesn't take away from how hard it is,
right.
But there's definitely a blessing. I mean, Jesus says, blessed are the persecuted.
Blessed are you,
You know what I mean? There's a special blessing on the persecution of the church because you really see the preciousness of Jesus in those.
And that's what
you don't
mean.
have anything else.
I think when he talks about, blessed are those who suffer persecution and mocking and everything, I think he's really talking about one of the blessings is you get a church where Jesus is precious.
Yeah.
And precious just really resonates with my heart and my desire for my own life, my desire for my family's life, my desire for the life of this church that God has called me to steward. I want to be a Christian where I can say that Jesus is my precious foundation. I want us to be a church where we can say Jesus is our precious foundation. And when you look at our lives, you see that lived out and you see that reflected.
Yeah.
So I love precious of the three adjectives. Really just it stirs something deep within me.
So what would you say to someone if they were like, all right, I love Jesus, but I don't know if he's precious to me?
I'd say that's a great place to begin. If you're unwilling to ask questions, you're not going to learn. You're not. Like, if you're unwilling to look in the mirror, if I'm unwilling to look in the mirror and say, is Jesus really precious to me? Then I'm never going to grow. And what I mean by that is, if I'm not willing to consider I need to grow, I'm not going to grow.
Yeah, because you won't see the need.
No. So I would say if you're asking that, wow, is Jesus really precious to me? Fantastic place. I'm so glad you're there. I love when Paul says, he's like, look, I don't regret that my letter grieved you because it grieved you to examination and repentance and transformation. You know what I mean? So I don't think we should ever be like, oh man, I'm such a failure that I'm even asking this question. It's like, no, praise God that you're willing to ask that question.
Yeah.
How do I know if Jesus is precious to me? Look at your investments. I'm stone broke, man. I make like minimum wage. I don't have investments. Yes, you do. You invest your thought life.
Yep.
You invest your time. You invest your conversations. You invest your money. You know what I mean? Like, so look at your life investment. If you can see that there is very clearly prioritization of Jesus, great. That I think is that'll help you answer that question. Is he precious to me? If you look at your life and you're like, well, I serve once a year because I have to. I give if I find an extra couple of bucks in my pocket, but only then. I read the Bible if I'm bored and there's nothing else I want to watch on TV.
Yeah.
I pray when the pastor prays at church. Like, you're not really making a whole lot of investment into what should be a precious part of your life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and so I think that's if we're asking the question, how do I know if Jesus is precious to me? Look at how you invest your life.
Yeah.
Does your heart beat for the same thing his heart beats for? Well, what's important to Jesus? And we're going to actually look at this kind of mild spoilers, but this week we're looking at knowledge psalms.
I think every week we almost give a spoiler.
Yeah. And so we're looking at psalms of knowledge, psalms of wisdom this coming week. And we're going to look at, that real knowledge of Christ is conformity to Christ. And I'm not like, that's not some clever thing that I'm making up. Like, that's the legitimate word. Like, that's what the word means. Like, in Hosea, when it says, when it talks about knowledge of God, it was a specific, like, tense or whatever. I don't know what the proper grammatical Hebrew, but it's a deliberate tweaking of the base word for knowledge that means knowledge, like, that leads to obedience and conformity. So like if there's no obedience,
then it's not.
If there's no conformity, then there's not actual knowledge. That's what the text says. That's not me being clever. And so I think one of the ways to ask, is Jesus precious to me? Am I driven to look more like him? Am I making every effort to look more like him?
Yeah.
If not, then I can't say I've got real knowledge of Jesus. So I think those are some of the questions that I would ask. If I'm asking that question, man, I love Jesus. I don't know if he's precious to me. How do you invest your life?
Yeah.
And does your life look like Jesus?
That's good. That's good. I think it's super practical. And then even like, one last point, I think, in your sermon, you talked about like Jesus's ability to relate to us or sympathize with us because he's tested and he's sure and he's a man of sorrows, gone through grief. We're not experiencing persecution on the level of, say, the Korean church.
Sure.
But we experience, I forget where it says it, I think in Peter, where it says like the same type of suffering is happening to all the believers across the entire world. What type of suffering is that? Life.
The suffering of life.
And sin and temptation and
the suffering of despair
and loss and
the looking at the world around us and saying, oh my goodness, how could things possibly get worse? The suffering of anxiety, the suffering of a temptation into cynicism, a temptation into pessimism, a suffering of temptation into sin.
Or even a suffering, and this was big a couple of months ago for me, a suffering unto holiness. So like a suffering, like you are suffering in denying yourself the pleasures of this world or denying the pleasures of your flesh so that you are walking towards holiness. Suffering.
Yep, there's a lot of that. And I want to end on a encouraging note. If you're like, oh my goodness, shoot, like, is Jesus precious to me? I inventoried my investments. Well, what verse did we look at? Because we have a Savior who's sympathetic to all of us, like, we can approach his throne with confidence to find grace and mercy in our times of need. Like, when we need help, it's promised to us. So if you're doing an inventory of your life and you're like, yeah, you know what, it seems like Jesus is precious to me, great, keep going after it, hard, with everything you have. You do an inventory of your life and you're like, I don't know, Jesus is precious to me. Okay, you know where to go. God's throne, Lord, make me someone who Jesus is precious to.
He will answer that prayer.
That's a simple prayer. Like,
he will
you don't know
not
how to pray?
no.
Literally repeat that. Lord, make me someone who Jesus is precious to. Like, cool.
Yep.
So be encouraged.
Yeah. Definitely be encouraged because we're going through suffering, and I really think it's in suffering that Jesus becomes precious to us. So,
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have any questions, any comments, we'd love to hear from you as always. Otherwise, we'll see you Sunday. Hey everyone, Pastor Sam here. Thanks for joining us for another midweek Bible study video. If you didn't see the sermon that we were talking about, you can find it here. Or if you're interested in more of these midweek Bible study videos and thoughts as Pastor Mario and I break things down, you can find that here as well. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all our content. Thanks for joining us.